Today's episode has been brought to you by Schedulicity.
Hello and welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Crow, a mom of three, a yoga teacher, and a trainer and consultant who works for yoga teachers. This podcast was created for you so that you can connect to the information and inspiration every single week and feel supported as you navigate these sometimes very tricky jungles of being a yoga teacher and also being an entrepreneur. I am really excited about today's episode. It's one that I have wanted to do for a long time, and I wanted to find a guest that had a perspective that I don't have. And I feel like we really have got that with today's episode. I can't wait until you hear the story of this and also just the really interesting perspectives that Shailla has to share. As yoga teachers, I'm sure we're all taught that yoga originated from India. I was reading an article the other day saying that yoga originated from Egypt, but I was taught that yoga originated from India. And we know that yoga has been practiced in India and South Asia for millennia. It's only recently that yoga has gained popularity in the Western world. For many of us who are teachers now, it might feel like it's been here a really long time. But it's really just recently if we look at the lifespan of yoga and when it came to the West. And it's been showcased in our mainstream health and fitness space and praised for its health benefits in that time here in the West. Over time, people within the yoga space have also adapted it to cater to different needs and trends. For example, one of the things that has happened is that yoga has been focused a lot on the physical aspects of yoga, or asanas, stripping it of the heritage and spirituality that inherently was carried with it before it came to the Western world. Today, there are so many different forms of yoga that exist, which can be sometimes very removed from the original practice that yoga was intended as. So this leads us to a really complex question. Is the yoga that we have here in the West, is it cultural appropriation? I have to admit that I was afraid to ask this question, but I think it's an important question to ask, and I really appreciate the complexity of this discussion. To dig into this question and to help us better understand how we can be sharing yoga with others in a way that is respectful, culturally sensitive, and appropriate, I invited Dr. Shailla Vaidya to share some of her perspectives on this as someone who is of South Asian descent and was raised in the yoga tradition. Shailla really opens up about her own personal experiences and talks about what we can do to really honor the tradition of yoga and share it in a way that is respectful of its heritage and history and the culture it comes from. I really learn and appreciate story, and Shailla does an amazing job of telling us the story of what it was like to grow up in the culture of yoga and then to step into a Western yoga class. So you might be like me, you might be a little hesitant to hear the answer to this question, but I think you're going to really appreciate the answer and then the different questions that will come up for you as a yoga teacher. All of our show notes are ready for you over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/184. So there you can find anything that we talk about in a link. I talk about a couple other podcasts and resources that you can look into. At the end of today's interview, I want to share with you an update of something that's going on in my personal life. So stay tuned for that at the end today. And before we dive in, I actually want to give a shout out to two people. Well, one person, one company. So a shout out to Schedulicity, our sponsor for today's episode, and also a company that I have grown to love since 2011 when I first started using them as a scheduling software. Just this week, I wanted to email everyone who's registered for a training that I'm offering. And it was so easy just to click of the button and everyone's email is there and ready for me. If you are a yoga teacher and you live in North America, I highly recommend that you check out Schedulicity. Let's hear our hot tip of the week from the team over there.
Hey there, Connected Yoga teachers. This is Emily with the Schedulicity Hot Tip of the Week. When you create and market yoga teacher training through Schedulicity, we can help you capture your students' impulse to book. Once you've created your workshop, it's a great idea to enable the payment add-on and choose to collect a deposit, full prepayment, or a credit card number at the time of online booking. This way, that money will go into your bank account when a client books, or if they don't show up, you can charge them based on the no-show policy you've created. Knowing that payment is taken care of allows you to put all of your mental energy into helping your students become the next generation of excellent teachers.
Thank you so much, Team Schedulicity, and thank you also to Jules, who left a review on iTunes for us. Jules says, "Thank you, Shannon, for your educational, caring, and compassionate podcast for yoga teachers. I love listening to your calm voice. It helps me relieve stress, especially during the quarantine time. Shannon is great at asking useful questions and sharing valuable information. She invites many interesting guests who are experts in various fields to educate the yoga community. Thank you for your time, effort, and resources. Special thank you for coming out and helping yoga teachers to transition online and just being there for them during this challenging time. I highly recommend this podcast for a yoga or wellness professional." Thank you so much, Jules, for taking the time to leave this review. This episode today that I recorded with Shailla was actually recorded back in June when things were really upside down for us yoga teachers and the world, really. You know, the pandemic was still in full force, and then we had the entire Black Lives Matter movement, and it really ties in nicely with this entire conversation. So thank you for saying that the podcast is helping you to relieve stress at this time. I hope that's still the case. And also we can, at the same time, dig into important conversations like this one. So let's dive in and meet Shailla. Dr. Shailla Vaidya is a physician and yoga therapist who practices mind-body medicine in Toronto, Ontario. She has over 10 years of experience in family and emergency medicine, but years of working in a toxic environment created immense stress and caused burnout. Shailla then took the opportunity to strengthen her own yoga practice and deepen her studies in yoga and Ayurveda. Today, Shailla teaches medically informed therapeutic yoga to yoga therapists internationally and offers programs such as concussion recovery, yoga of stress resilience, and burnout recovery program. By combining the science of Western medicine with the Eastern mind-body practice of yoga, she helps clients understand their physiology, natural responses, and how they can recover from the effects of stress and burnout. Let's meet Shailla. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast, Shailla. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and honored.
Me too. I feel like we set this interview up so long ago. A lot has happened. So just for our listeners, right now we are recording this in June of 2020. And how long have we been in the pandemic? I can't even remember how long we've been, that it's declared a pandemic. And we just went through, and here's the thing, I don't even know what to call it, what we just went through, but where it felt like the world was waking up to Black Lives Matter. I don't know what we'll call it.
I think sometimes we'll call it the crash of 2020 or something, or the burning down. In Hinduism, we have a story of we have Brahma, who's like the creator. It's kind of like the Christian trilogy, where you have the creator, Vishnu is our sustainer, and Shiva is often been interpreted as the destroyer, but it's really evolution. That Shiva does this dance of the Nataraj, where everything burns down, and that has to happen for things to rise up in the right order again, much like the rise of the phoenix. So I kind of think of 2020 as this year, or the year when everything kind of started to burn down. And remember, we started this year with fires in Australia. So the world was burning. We've seen the floods. The pandemic hit and started probably in 2019, but started to spread definitely through the beginning of 2020. Many of us had to completely change the way we were doing things, and our old ways of lives or our livelihoods completely changed as well. So it was almost a burning down of a lot of our income and a lot of our businesses. And then, this epitome of Black Lives Matter, like not another life. And in this way, it was so graphic and it was so incredibly wrong. And there's no question, you cannot question what that officer did to George Floyd was wrong, absolutely wrong. And I think we're at a turning point for so many things, but especially around this, of asking ourselves, is this okay or is this not okay? And this is not okay. And there's many things that are not okay. Right now, obviously, we have to root out racism and deal with this. We also have to look at how we're treating our earth and all the people and beings that live off of it. So there's many changes that are coming. And I think this is often how things play out in history. And it's such an important turning point that we really have to stop and ask ourselves, what is the way forward? Because what we were doing, that wasn't okay.
I love this summary. This is so good. This idea of like burning down and the image of the phoenix and how Shiva is very much shown in those stories in that way. This is a really good way to summarize what 2020 has felt like. And in that, I think, well, for a while now, I've been looking at the topic of cultural appropriation. I'm glad we're going to talk about that and examine it a little bit more. But before we even get into that, tell our listeners who you are, where you're located, and what is the work that you do.
Okay, well, so my name is Shailla Vaidya. I am a family and emergency medicine physician. I used to do emergency medicine, then I did family medicine. And that evolved to what I'm doing now, which is my body medicine, and I am the Yoga MD. So what I'm doing now, I've been working in healthcare for about 20 years now. I graduated from medical school in 1999, and it's kind of a long and a short story. When I first started medicine, I was very interested in trying to combine the Eastern practices with Western medicine. My last name, Vaidya, for those of you who practice Ayurveda, you know that Vaidya is an Ayurvedic physician. So it's kind of in my namesake to do what I'm doing, which, looking back on it. But yeah, that was my interest. And then, of course, as we all have to do, as we're learning our professions in medicine, does not afford you a lot of time for your own self-identity. It's you really have to focus on learning the practice. And so graduated, practiced family and emergency medicine. As part of that, I was very fortunate to work up north in the Moose Factory Zone and in the Sioux Lookout Zone in our Indigenous populations along the James Bay. And what I saw there was what happens when a culture is completely destroyed. And that was a genocide that was done to our Indigenous population here in North America. I know the Australians can relate to that. But that taking away of the cultural backbone, the fabric that held that people together, and how that created such illness. And being a Western physician going in there, and filling out yet another prescription for metformin and diabetes medications, like it just I was just shaking my head. This is not what they need. And after that, I was practicing Emerge. I was switching to family practice. I started a family practice in Mississauga, West Mississauga Medical, with a friend of mine's clinic. And of course, that's Mississauga has a large South Asian population. It was on the border of Mississauga and Brampton. So I had a lot of patients from those areas. Again, my name is Dr. Vaidya. So people were coming expecting this blend of East and West, especially when they're seeing an Indian physician. And at that time, I recognized that a lot of my own people living here in Ontario, because I'm based in Toronto, I forgot to mention that, were again cut off from their culture. They were removed, and that culture has been shamed through colonialism and so many other things. And that, we come to the West, we should adopt Western ways. And what I saw was the same thing I saw in Moose Factory. Of course, what has been done to the Indigenous population is by no comparison to the lives that were being lived by the South Asians that I was seeing. However, that removal from culture was causing a lot of illness. And in the South Asian population, we have a huge rate of diabetes. We had a huge rate of depression and so many other things. And so it was just so natural to start teaching yoga and meditation and bringing that to my practice, because I could clearly see what was happening. One thing led to another in my career, very frustrated with the medical system. I went off and did a health management degree. I came back trying to make change in the system. And what I realized as I was practicing, we were doing some innovative things like medical group visits, bringing people together in community, because it's really that sangha that we talk about in yoga, that community feeling of people who are experiencing the same thing, that they heal in connection, right? So this is what I was doing in my medical practice. And again, I always had people that were struggling more. And at that time, I started to screen my patients for the Adverse Childhood Experience Score, which if you haven't heard about it, you can look up under ascores2high.com. It looks at childhood trauma and traumatic events, 10 in particular, that if somebody experienced before the age of 18 can affect their health outcomes later on in life. So as I was screening my patients, I realized all of my patients who had high ACE scores were the same ones I was also teaching yoga and meditation to. And at this time, I wasn't in Mississauga. I was my practice at this time was in Toronto, and I didn't have a mainly South Asian practice at this time, but I had lots of immigrants and I had lots of people. And the deciding factor on who I was using yoga for were the ones that had the higher ACE score, more trauma in their background. And they were also the ones with more chronic illness. What we know about that ACE score, I'm just going to take my little time to plug the ACE score, because this is so important. It's especially important for us as yoga teachers. What we know is scores of 2 or higher often indicate there's a higher risk for people who have scores of 2 or higher to have anxiety or depression. 4 or higher, more chronic illness. So not just mental illness, but inflammatory disorders, cardiovascular disorders, heart disorders, metabolic disorders such as diabetes, rheumatological disorders such as like autoimmune illnesses like rheumatoid arthritis, things like that. And then scores of 9 or higher were, they correlated to a lifespan of 20 years less than what another person who didn't have that score would have. And that research was originally done in an obesity clinic in San Diego at Kaiser Permanente. So in order to have Kaiser insurance in the US in 1997, when this study was published, you had to have a pretty good job. So we're not necessarily looking at social determinants of health, poverty, education, the kind of things that hold back people we know in impoverished situations, but actually looking at personal things that happen in the home for those people who had adverse experiences. And what we think is that their nervous systems are primed for stress, and that the stress can cause more illnesses down the road. And the beautiful thing is yoga, if we're doing it properly, can help regulate the nervous system and really help these people. That's a whole other podcast. But having said that, that's kind of the nutshell of what I do now. And now actually, so I've written a program for stress. My main focus is actually on helping professionals with stress, burnout, because they're giving back to these communities. And then in 2018, I had a head injury, now doing the same thing for concussion.
So are you teaching yoga all the time now? Or are you still working as a physician?
So this is where the intersection is so interesting. I combine both medicine and the group medical visit and yoga. So I am certified as a yoga therapist. So for my concussion group, I will bring them all in as a group. We do a practice that is therapeutic, helping to do contralateral movements, breath work to reset the nervous system. So I do believe it's combining, working on the nervous system and basically trying to bring them into the relaxation response, bring them back into that window of tolerance where we're in our parasympathetic nervous system. So it's a really fine line where I don't know what to tell you. I think it's medical. It might not be. I think yoga therapists can do the same thing, but I also bring into the group visit I do bring in a discussion around healing from concussion. And so that part I'm doing as a physician, that part is also medical.
Okay, this is so interesting to me. And I love how you're like, I'm not sure, is this medical or is this yoga? What I want to know is, what do people think? Like when they go to book an appointment with you, are they booking at a doctor's office?
Yeah. So I am very lucky to work in Toronto. I actually work out of a doctor's office that has a meditation room in it. And that meditation room was, it was built by Dr. Pat Rockman, who does MBCT and is at the Center for Mindfulness Studies. So she was moving out of this room when I was looking for a space. So and I actually started off, I get referrals from doctors still. I still only get referrals from doctors or social workers or nurse practitioners, but from the medical community. Used to have the medical chart, used to look at all their blood work, take blood pressures, look at metabolic factors. Since I hit my head, not doing as much of that because it's a little bit harder for my brain to look at lab results and write prescriptions without making an error. So I'm not doing that much of that part now, but I was. And I do look at their whole medical profile. So prior, I've been doing a lot of one-on-one, so applying yoga therapy as a medical therapeutic intervention. And I would get referrals from neurologists, people who have what we call medical symptoms not otherwise specified, NOS. So I get a lot of support from the medical community in Toronto, actually, for what it is I do. And so I'm really blessed that way. And this is really, this is kind of like my grandfather's dream, right? Like, he had I remember when he was 81 and I saw him, he was this cranky 81-year-old. I had 6 kids and not one of them became a doctor. And my older brother became a doctor. And he was like, I had to have a grandchild before anyone listened to me. And then he was so proud of his grandson, obviously, who's become this doctor. And it's a real beautiful thing to be Vaidya, to know what my namesake is, and to have the opportunity to combine the medical practice with the yoga practice. Since I've hit my head, things have changed. I'm not doing as much of the medical, and I'm definitely going to be doing more of the yoga, but that's okay. That's just how it's going to have to pan out.
That's amazing. We did an episode with Anne Green who talked about her concussion as a yoga teacher and what that means in her life and how yoga helps her. Yeah. Also, when you're talking, it's really making me think of, I've been taking a course with Carolyn Van Dyken, and we'll have her on the podcast talking about the biopsychosocial model of care. Yeah. And I really love that you take this measurement. So this is the piece that I think is so often missing in the yoga world, that is there in the medical world, is to measure and then see, that the scientist in me gets really excited when we can see, we can monitor progress, or we can see where someone's at with different things, and especially even with the amount of childhood trauma that we've had and how we see that plays out. We understand as yoga teachers that stress has an effect on the body physically and on the brain. But there are measurements. It's really exciting to see that the medical world is also saying the same thing.
Oh yeah, and that we can measure heart rate variability and what we now call cardiac coherent breathing, which is really manipulation of the breath, which we call pranayama in yoga. So it's amazing to me to practice medicine at this time where I can see the science coming in and for yoga teachers as well, that there are some proven scientific benefits when we're applying the principles properly.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And this really ties along with what we see happening right now in our Black communities. We see that the stress that Black people have had to deal with plays out. And if someone is questioning what it's like to be pulled out of your culture, or to have someone thrust their culture on you, make sure you chat with someone who has done that, who has had that experience. Or I certainly don't know that experience, but I know the experience of traveling to a country where no one speaks my language and no one has the same color of skin as me, and it really isolates you very quickly. And I was on holidays, when that becomes that's your day-to-day, it really impacts an entire society. So this is why I think it's important that we're looking at, I don't know when it started for me of seeing, oh, wait a second, I don't know if we should say namaste at the end of class. Or what about saying Om, and hearing about cultural appropriation. And honestly, I have to be very honest, because I feel like a lot of our yoga teachers are feeling this way. I thought at first, well, all of yoga is taken from a different culture. So does that mean that I stop teaching yoga or stop practicing yoga? So where did your journey begin with cultural appropriation and like the understanding of that? I'm sure it's different than mine.
Well, it is, but I'm so thankful that we're having this conversation and that we started it around the concept of stress, actually. Because for me, growing up as a person of color, as an Indian, I grew up in Nova Scotia, love Nova Scotia, but in a predominantly white community. So all of a sudden, I was this brown person from a brown family with a religion that wasn't Christian. All of a sudden, I was a heathen, right? And called out from my religious beliefs by neighbors and people I went to school with, that, my clothes smell, or my food smelled, and my clothes were weird. And I looked just like my other friend who was Indian, who I did not look alike, but nobody could tell us apart. And so for me, cultural appropriation is buried along with that stress response, that I grew up as other, and that was what we now would call a race-based traumatic injury. And that's a term I learned from Dr. Gail Parker, who is a fabulous woman. Please contact her and get her on the podcast. But when I first heard that term, I was like, yes, this is what I'm feeling. It's like for my whole life, there was something about me that was wrong, and it was shameful. And I had to change the way my name was said or what people called me so I could blend into this white culture or this dominant culture, wherever it is the dominant culture, that the way I prayed was wrong. Actually, it's wrong. So many things that I had to hide, even my parents' name in school. When you talk about what your parents' name and everybody else's parents' name are John and Mary or Anne and Peter, my parents' names are Om and Kiran or Om and Cora. She goes by Cora. And that is different, and nobody can spell my name, right? There's a reason I go by Yoga MD and not Vaidya MD, because nobody can spell Vaidya. So I've had to make a lot of changes. And then, I'm doing yoga. I've been doing yoga my whole life. It's not something I learned to do or came across. It's something that's a part of my culture. I did it in my mother. I learned the stories growing up. I saw it done by the elders in my community. It was taught to me in that way. And it was taught in a particular context. So then in the yoga really boomed in North America around the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, right? Just at the turn of the century. And all of a sudden it was like Bikram yoga, and it was like power yoga, and the Ashtangis all came out. I can tell you, I did not know what Ashtanga yoga was until I went to India in 2013. I assumed when people were talking about Ashtanga yoga, they were talking about the yamas, niyamas, asana, pranayam, dharana, dhyana, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. Like, I had no idea who Pattabhi Jois was at all. And this was after I'd been doing yoga and working in my medical practice doing yoga. So it was actually really hard for me as a person of color, as an Indian person, to walk into a yoga studio and to see the Om symbol everywhere when I was shamed for that. To see Shiva the Nataraj as a statuette when I was shamed for that. How is it okay that you can use these symbols when I was repeatedly bullied and shamed and put down for my culture? How is it okay that you can do this as a white person, make money off of it? Because for me, that was just something we did for our community. We didn't have yoga teachers. We didn't have certifications. We just learned from our elders, and we taught we taught the way you would offer service in Sunday school. So it's a very deep pain. And, I knew it for a while, but it really came out the first time I went to Sitar, which is the didn't really come out at Sitar, but I didn't expect it to come out at Sitar. Symposium for Yoga Therapy and Research, which is held by the IAYT, International Association of Yoga Therapists. I remember going to my first Sitar meeting, and I was so excited. It's like yoga therapy, the techniques are going to be great. I already knew some people who were like what I called kindred spirits in promoting yoga as a therapeutic process. And I felt so out of place there. I was like, what is going on? There was hardly anyone else who was Indian. Everyone kept asking me, when was the first time I ever did yoga? Like, when did you come to yoga? I'm like, I'm Indian. It's a part of my culture. And then they would be like, oh, well, I studied with Deskachar, or I studied with so-and-so. And I'm like, yeah, okay. But, I've been doing it since it's just part of the stories that we tell. And it was really painful. I felt so alone, and I almost felt like I was an imposter. And I imagine I had this feeling before, because when I decided at one point in my medical career that actually I wanted to take some time and go and study yoga and become a yoga teacher, I remember I would be doing sun salutations in a yoga class, and I'd always have a hard time about what's the next step. I couldn't remember the next step. And I did my yoga teacher training with the Mohans in India, who they're students of Krishnamacharya. They helped build KYM, Krishnamacharya Yoga Manindram, with Deskachar. They have a book called Yoga Therapy and Yoga Body, Breath, and Mind. And the first time we did a sun salutation with A.G. Mohan, with Mohanji, he did it properly, chanting. That's how I did it as a kid. Om Haram, Om Harim, Om Haram. And I'd forgotten that that's the way my pundit had taught me to do a sun salutation, or I don't even know if he taught me as much as he was doing it. And so that's what we followed. And so I'd be in these Western yoga studios trying to do a sun salutation, and there'd be these missing pieces. And it wasn't until I saw Mohanji do this sun salutation that I was like, oh, the missing piece. I knew it. And then all of a sudden, sun salutation became so natural to me, because it's it just wasn't taught properly in the Western yoga studio. That's why I was having such a hard time with what is it we're doing here? And I've had those moments in yoga studios since, and it's when we talk about cultural appropriation, it does become hard, because it's once I was at doing a practice with a teacher who started to sing a Sikh hymn at the end when we were lying in Shavasana. And I do not want to take away from the work that this woman has done to, one, learn the music, to sing the music, to master that, because that is phenomenal that somebody would dedicate that time to learn music and share it. I think that's beautiful. But I was so pulled out of Shavasana, I was totally in shock, because here was a sacred Sikh hymn. I was lying there in my Lulus. My head wasn't covered. My arms weren't covered. I was half naked. This was not the context that I was used to listening to this type of music in. The song wasn't sung appropriately in how I'm used to hearing it in the language that's naturally spoken. So there was an accent change, but that actually pronounced some of the words differently, and I actually understood some of the words. So it made me feel really uncomfortable, and I didn't know what to say. I was in such shock. Yet I knew other people were enjoying it. And I was happy that other people are enjoying other cultures, that they're appreciating other cultures. And yet I'm still struggling with, is this appropriation, or why am I feeling this pain? What is happening here? So I'm so glad that we're talking about cultural appropriation. I'm glad that we talked about stress to begin with, because I think understanding that stress of childhood and the experience of South Asians, particularly South Asians that grew up here in North America, or maybe in Europe or in Australia, away from India, make it a little bit of a harder subject. Now, I don't want to take away from what happened in India, because I think you have to understand that what happened in India was that they were colonized by the British. And during that time of colonization, Indian practices were shamed. So families were shamed and jailed in some places for practicing yoga. They were shamed for being who they were. They were taught that what they were wasn't right, and that they must adopt this Western way of thinking. And that's where I resonate with what happened to our Indigenous populations, because they were shamed in the same way. On their land, taken from their parents and sent to residential schooling. in India, most of us actually stayed with our parents. So the trauma of residential schooling is, I think we can all feel that it's so much bigger. I mean, I want to say it is, but I know that my great uncles, one uncle is still alive, thank God, that some of my other uncles, they went to jail as political prisoners, inspired by Gandhi in this non-violent protest to overthrow the British. This is the Gandhi's protest, which also inspired Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela. So it's pretty powerful. And this is where I'm going to get a little tangential. I remember being a kid and being taken to see the movie Gandhi in the film. And if you haven't seen Gandhi and you're a yoga teacher, you have to watch Gandhi. You have to understand the history and the culture of India, because you're teaching something that was based in this from the Indian culture. And you have to understand what was done to these people, to my ancestors who went to jail for this, and I remember going back to India as a medical student, and one of my uncles who had gone to jail, my Hindi is terrible. And I was shamed for speaking Hindi when I was a kid. So I just didn't. It was wrong. It was bad. I only wanted to speak English. Said to me at one point, he looked at me, he said, you only speak the language of the conqueror or of our colonizer. And I was so embarrassed. It hurt me so much. And I've worked to try to get my language back, but that's been difficult here. And when my parents came here, it was very much assimilate. We know not to do that now. We know for immigrants coming through that first teach your child the mother tongue, they will learn English in school. But that's still hard, right? So when we talk about appropriation, I think we have to understand why it's so painful. And those are things that make it painful. The experience that many of us have as South Asians, the difference in how we see yoga practiced in a yoga studio versus what we know is yoga, and the fact that people are making money off of this, of something that is our culture. So the definition of cultural appropriation is when we don't acknowledge, or it's the inappropriate adoption of particular cultural practices and ideas of one people or society by a member of another society, typically members who are, so it's the dominant culture that is taking from a non-dominant culture, or a culture that has been shamed or suppressed, and that dominant culture is using it to their benefit. So
I really want to call back a couple of things that really struck me here. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your own personal story with it, because then it stops us as yoga teachers who maybe don't know the personal story it stops us for a moment to think, oh, this is what it's about. Instead of getting defensive of why we're doing what we're doing, to stop and listen. And a couple of things that really popped out is, how would we, all people, feel if we grew up being shamed for everything of our culture? Like you said, the food that you ate, the prayers that you said, the language, the songs, the color of your skin, like things that we can change and not change, and things that are baked right into our DNA and the way we were raised. To be shamed for it and to be told, don't do any of those things, and then to turn around and see, I'm just going to call it out because I can, white people then taking that thing and, like you said, plastering it all over the place without understanding where it even came from.
Yeah.
That's something. And the other thing you said was you felt like an imposter in a yoga class. Something's very wrong then.
Yeah. And I felt like an imposter at a yoga conference. And it wasn't till the next year I went back again, because I actually value sitar. And I met a person who's now a good friend of mine, Priya Sani Varma. Sorry, I said her name wrong, Priya Sani Varma. And she had the same look in her face. And I knew what that look was right away. And I named it. And she's like, oh my God. And since then, every time I've met an Indian person at a yoga conference, I will go up to them and say, hey, this is my name. I've started this group called the South Asian Network for Yoga and Ayurveda. And it's not like a group where I'm trying to sell anything, because I think a lot of people do that with Facebook. This is a group where we can come together as South Asians who teach this the way our parents taught it to us, our grandparents taught it to us. We understand that India is a subcontinent with many different cultures, and that may have been taught things in many different ways, and we respect that. So that's what that group is about. And every time I've gone somewhere and introduced myself to another South Asian person with that, saying, I want to invite you to this group because this is a real thing, I have been met most commonly with tears and thank yous, because this is what I'm feeling and I couldn't name it. I'm feeling such discomfort, and I'm feeling this pain, and I'm feeling like I'm not seen, and I'm feeling like I don't belong. And yet this is my culture, and I was shamed for it. And now look at it. Like, how come it's okay for these guys to do it?
Right. So it's not like, and that's a big, important part of the story, because I'm sure you would love to see yoga spread all around the world, but with an understanding of the roots of it and an understanding of the roots of the collective trauma that would be felt around that, like being shamed or having not being able to practice or being thrown in jail for practicing. I think that's really, your story has really highlighted it, because I know that sometimes I'm like, oh gosh, when you learn something, someone was going around changing, this is totally not related to cultural appropriation. I want to pull it out of that. But there was a movement to like change different sayings that we have in English. Like, instead of kill two birds with one stone, it was feed two birds with one something, piece of bread or something. And I remember thinking, oh, come on, it's like that piece of resistance. So take someone like me. So I studied yoga in 2006 was when I took my yoga teacher training. Nobody was talking about cultural appropriation at that time. Nobody. My teacher studied with someone from India. I bet they didn't ever have the conversation. And I know my yoga class ended in an Irish folk song. Like, everything got mushed together. So I'd love to hear from you. What do you think? Like, knowing that we're learning as we go, what do you wish yoga teachers knew about, like, some of the things that just make you cringe and you're like, oh, if you only knew why this is not okay?
Yeah. And with that, I'll say there's some things that didn't get translated. I will answer why it's not okay in a second. But remember, India was impoverished. A lot of people went to India to learn yoga, and there were people who took advantage of that. So there were gurus, self-proclaimed gurus, who said, sure, I'll teach you yoga. And they made money. And this is a great business. Go back and teach. And then they taught what they were taught, and they taught it blindly. Like, this is what I was taught. I'm just going to do it like this. And maybe it wasn't translated appropriately. So things like namaste at the end. I'm pretty sure what happened there was, like, we call Anjali Mudra. We often say that's Namaste Mudra, because we as Indians will say namaste or namaskar or namaskaram if you're from the South to greet somebody when we first meet them at the beginning. But we may pray or bow down at the end, right? I often touch my head, my mouth, and my heart with Anjali Mudra. But somebody may have said, I think somebody probably said do namaste at the end, meaning the mudra, and everybody just started to say namaste at the end instead of the beginning. So that always makes me cringe.
So you're like, that doesn't belong at the end. That's a greeting. Like, hey. That's like saying hi, and you're ending class with hello, how are you? Kind of
Exactly. So that makes me cringe. When sacred symbols are used inappropriately, makes me cringe. The Om symbol, this is a great story. A friend of mine who's a yoga teacher, she's white. She studied with me with the Mohans in India. She used to have a necklace that had the Om symbol on it. She was doing some grocery shopping in Scarborough, and somebody asked her if she was Hindu, and she said no. Why would you think that? And he said, well, you're wearing the Om symbol. And I don't know that people in the yoga community understand that the Om symbol is used to represent Hinduism or the religion or the sacredness of it, much like the cross is for Christianity, the Star of David is for Judaism, the crescent moon is for Islam, and etc. So sometimes it bothers me when I see that symbol placed in places where we wouldn't place that symbol. We never put that symbol on the ground. We, as Indians, don't even put books on the ground because we consider books sacred, right? So we always, you don't put a book on the ground, you don't step on anything that's sacred. So when I see that, that kind of upsets me. Music, when certain music is played, when bhajans are played, or when people start. So I have to explain something else. You know, I grew up in a family, my mother was religious, my father was a yogi. And never did the two meet. So in my head, there's a very big distinction between what is yoga and what is religion and how those come together. Now, in reality, India it's a complex, chaotic system, and everything mixes. And so there really isn't a distinct line. But I want people to know that the symbols that they may be using or portraying are not necessarily yoga symbols. They're actually religious symbols. So one of my patients, I remember being a family doctor, and one of my patients came in, she was talking about something, and she said, I wonder if they know when they say Om Shanti 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 at the end that they're praying. And I said, no, I think they just think they're offering peace. But for us, we say that at the end of a prayer, right? Much like Jews would say Shalom, Shalom, Shalom. Muslims have their own phrase. Christians say, may peace be with you. It's a phrase. But for us, it's often used at the end of a prayer. So that kind of bothers me. And I think if you're going to learn a Sanskrit chant, then pronounce it properly, and which is hard. Even Indian people have a hard time pronouncing it properly. But acknowledge. Do the thing of acknowledging. This is an ancient practice that we are practicing. This comes from India, and acknowledge that, because a lot of people don't know, or they don't realize that it's one of the 7 darshans, philosophies of my culture, and they feel like they have to explain it to me. Like, I'm also insulted when somebody asks me that I should do a yoga teacher training with them, and I'm trying not to laugh my head off at that point, not to be rude, but like, what am I going to learn from you? Like, I know a lot about this because it's inherent in how I grew up, right? So there's a few things, and every one of us, it's like you don't know until it gets you in the gut, right? You see something, it gets you in the gut, and you're like, oh my God, that is something that bothers me. So those are the things that bother me. And I also don't like when people are really airy-fairy or flaky around it. This is a very serious practice, right? Meditation, it's a focus, it's a tapas action. Like, we have to understand what it is we're doing. This is a discipline. I hear of yoga teacher trainings. A friend of mine in San Diego just said the other day, yeah, his friend did this yoga teacher training and they didn't even learn about the gunas. What are you teaching if you don't understand the basics of we're trying to balance, come back into sattva from the states of rajas and tamas that are always going through? If you're teaching a yoga teacher training and you don't have a background in the philosophy, what are you teaching? If you're a yoga teacher that spent money on a training that didn't give you that basis, question the people who did, because that's not right.
When I left my first 200-hour yoga teacher training, we were really strong in philosophy, but I got called out for a downward dog in my next teacher training because it wasn't right.
Your body isn't my body. The way your body does downward dog isn't mine. There's only 3 things that explain the asana. Sthira Sukhasana, that we should be stable and comfortable in the pose, that our breath should be coordinated that our breathing should be coordinated, and that when our movement and our breath coordination is stable, that's when we hit the state of yoga. That's when we come into union. And so, and I'm not perfect at all of that stuff either, right? But there's more to this, and it is a practice, and we're all learning, and we want to show respect to that. And yeah, I could go on, but it just we don't have that much time.
Well, we have lots of time as yoga teachers to unpack this. So I think that's one thing that, I just want to call out that I learned to end yoga classes with namaste, and it becomes a habit. When I first heard about, let's not end classes like this. This is like saying hello. I remember ending class and then thinking, now all my students are wondering what I'm doing. So I just explained it to them. I just said, I've always done this thing that we did, and now I just learned this thing, and I'm learning as I go. And I want to take here's here's the thing. I don't want to take away that part where we start to question what we're doing, because we're in a day and age right now where we have to really examine what we've been doing as a whole culture, as a whole planet of people.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to take that away. I also don't want to push yoga teachers to the point where they just throw their hands up and they're like, well, I can't do anything right. I'm just going to do what I'm doing and never question this. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Absolutely. I mean, none of us are perfect with anything, right? Like if you were Italian and you came home to my house and my mother was making a spaghetti dinner, you'd probably have you'd probably be like, oh, that's not how you do it. This is how you do it. So, but I think acknowledging, like, for one thing, it might not be questioning why am I doing, or I can't remember the question you asked, why am I doing this? But understanding why we're doing something, right? Like, and then as teachers explaining, this is why we're doing this, and recognizing that I learned this from my teacher. Somebody else may have learned it separately or differently, but acknowledging that, right? And that none of us are perfect. All of us are learning, and this is what growth is. And I think that was another Black Lives Matter meme where somebody was like, well, isn't it all lives matter? Isn't this, isn't that? And then somebody said, well, if I go back, if I agree with you now, does that make me a hypocrite? And the thing is, no, it means you're growing.
Right.
And that's what we all have to allow room for. A friend of mine told me, another friend of mine from yoga told me, it's really hard because the people who are doing yoga and who are learning this are also the people who are open to other cultures. So if you all of a sudden, like lambaste them and say, you can't do this that way, you can't do it that way, you're also closing the door on people who are actually interested in learning. And I think that's really important, that we recognize that all of us are learning, and we do want to be open to all these cultures, and we do want to enjoy it and appreciate them. And I think that's the difference between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. And in that, it means acknowledging people who may be from that culture. It means creating safe spaces for different body types, because whether you recognize this or not, everybody's body is different. And if my body was genetically supposed to be in India, growing up on Indian food, coming to the West with all the changes in the food and the lifestyle, my body is going to look a lot different than what you may think a healthy body looks like. And I know many people who do not feel, regardless of color, of race or however we want to divide it, who do not feel comfortable going into a yoga studio. And I think that's the number one thing that as the yoga MD I face, is people coming in saying, look, my doctor told me I should come here, but I can't do a downward dog and I don't think I can. And I'm like, honey, you don't have to show up in Lulu's. Like, we don't even wear Lulu's, right? You don't even have to own a mat. Yeah. Nobody in India owned a mat. This is a new Western invention, right? Like, they came in their pajamas. They did it when they first woke up. This has nothing to do. Every body type can do this. This is not about the pose. This is about doing something for our body to recenter ourselves, to come back into that sattvic state. So I think it's being open, that we don't know everything, that we're all still learning. I'm still learning. There's still so much to learn, that our practice teaches us this, that we be open, and that we don't get defensive, but we also recognize when we're profiting off somebody. Like it's really hard being a person of color or an Indian person trying to do this. I've been told by many people that I'm not marketable, that nobody will come. Like, I've applied to yoga conferences where people are like, I don't know, I don't think it would be that good to have you. It's okay, we're gonna, and then you'll look at who's going to this or who's presenting at the yoga conference, and it's like, and I don't want to downplay the work that goes into organizing a yoga conference. I don't, because I know that's like organizing a wedding and all that stuff. So please, for you people who organize yoga conferences, I'm not putting down the work that you do, but look at who's presenting and who's getting that opportunity. I've gone through pages of yoga flyers where there has not been, or there's been like 30 teachers, all of whom are dominant culture. There may be one person who's Indian, maybe one person who's Black. And you have to think about this, like, wait a second. What are we learning here? Who are we learning it from? Is this authentic? And I think this is where the yoga community, especially in North America, needs to open up and recognize that people who have this in their culture are not the prominent yoga teachers. They're not the ones who are benefiting in a business model from this, even though many of them will teach you and then you'll take this on and make lots of money. For us, it's considered service, right? Like if I teach kids, I'm not getting paid for that. I'm teaching them part of their culture. That's something that I volunteer to do. But then I can't make money to support that work as a yoga teacher because as I've been told, so I'm not saying everybody thinks this way, that I'm not marketable.
Right.
And who are you following and why are you following them? And Priya and I have had this conversation. It comes down to who's relatable. And that's where the subconscious comes in, because we might not know that we're making these choices based on certain things. We're just going to what feels comfortable and what's relatable to us. And that might not mean somebody from a different culture. So that's these layers are really deep when we're asking about, when we're looking at anti-racist policies or the system or being open and inviting. The problem is that we go to what we know and what's comfortable. And that's not necessarily somebody from another culture, even if we're learning something about the other culture. And that's the level we have to get to, is that if we're really open and if we really want to appreciate another culture, it actually means starting to get comfortable with that other culture and not being afraid of them if they're wearing the wrong clothes or if they smell different because their food is different. But it's like opening up to that. It's really deep. All of us have to do this work.
I wonder if you have a list of people like that you could say, follow these people. They learned yoga as young children, like it was in their culture. Yeah. I wonder if you, like, not right now off the top of your head, but that I think is one step that we can take. And we've learned that in the whole time of Black Lives Matter, like follow more Black people. Let's do that. So we could follow more people who are Indian and practice yoga. The other thing I'm thinking of is when we open that conference book and we see white face after white face, we can reach out to the conference the conference people, because our dollars really matter then, and say, I would love to attend your conference because it's close to home and I love joining in community, but I actually won't be showing up because I see you have very limited people of color here. Or, I'll show up the year that you have more people of color. Here are 5 people that I'm following. We as yoga teachers can be part of the solution. Even if we, took a 200-hour yoga teacher training and we never learned the gunas, like we could go back and study that. And I covered the koshas on the podcast and I was really hesitant to do it because I am not... I ask a lot more questions than have answers about the philosophy of yoga.
You should. We all should be doing that. And recognize one more thing when it comes to yoga philosophy. It's a real privilege to learn it. It's a real privilege to learn chanting. This is actually not even something that's offered to many people who are Indian, right? Like the culture was shamed. It was taken out of the school system. Many people didn't grow up with knowing about this stuff, and it's starting to come back up, because the Western lifestyle has done nothing for the Indian population other than make them sick. So unfortunately, one of the things that Modi is doing, and I'm not a fan, is that he is trying, it's so hard, that he is trying to bring back some of that history and research. Unfortunately, he is doing it in a way that is more fascist, in that he's dividing and conquering with that and trying to dominate. And that's not what we want. But having said that, it's important to learn some of these things. And if your 200 hours didn't go over yoga philosophy, that's okay. But we all have to learn. So there's people who are offering courses. And look at who you're choosing to buy that course from, what their background is, what they learned, whether they're just rehashing what somebody is taught them, or whether they're actually doing what you've done, what you're saying, Shannon, which is asking a lot of questions around it. Because remember, these are sutras. These are things that you can't just memorize the sutra and kind of go word for word, this is what this means, and then say it. It actually has a meaning. The other thing that's really important that that you do when you're studying this is that you don't necessarily take an English word to replace what the Sanskrit word is, and then use that English word to mean something else. So an example for this, I was reading on Instagram one day, somebody put satya as truth and then brought it down to like telling the truth and honest. And I made the comment, it's not so much truth in an honesty kind of way, although of course all of us should be honest. I'm not putting that down. But it's the word truth in that is knowledge. It's not that I'm just not going to lie because I'm satya. No, it's understanding that truth is the philosophical truth or the one truth of the world that we all know, and it probably comes down to love at the end of the day for everybody, right? Like in every culture. But that you have to be careful that when you're interpreting through your own language and culture, that you're not misinterpreting. And I think the biggest thing that happens for all of us and all cultures is that we misinterpret the other culture, and then that becomes what it's about in English. And actually, it came down to the root translation. That first person who translated to English made the mistake, and that's why we all think of it this way. So be aware that there are many translations and interpretations, because this was philosophy that was codified to help people in an oral culture remember, but that it does need to be parceled out and analyzed. And that's why we have philosophy in every culture, because every philosophy does that. So yeah, that's what I would say. Ask those questions. Make sure you're really getting what it is. You could spend a year on one Yoga Sutra at least, So yeah.
That's what I was thinking. And the other thing is to give voice to those teachers. So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on, like, I love how you said, find out where that person learned from.
Yeah.
Does that mean, like, are we best to study with someone who has studied Sanskrit and is from India and who grew up in this culture? Should we be looking for that teacher? Do you have some guidance around that?
Yeah, I think you can't just say it's going to be an Indian teacher. Because let's face it, then you'd say it could be Bikram. No, right? So
very good example.
Yeah, you have to be careful about the teacher you pick, and you have to understand what their motivation for teaching is, and you have to see how they teach and how they treat people. And I think that's really important. I think you have to understand power relationship. And I think you have to make sure you're with somebody who is not abusing power. I think we saw that a lot with a lot of Indian gurus when they were, attracting people. My rule of thumb is I never follow anyone who calls themselves a guru.
Right.
Guru is a name that you give to a teacher. Gu means Gu means dark, Ru means light. It's the person who takes you from the darkness to the light. So that's not a term somebody can just take and say, I am such and such guru. No, if they're saying that, cut them out of the line. Those aren't the people you want to learn from right away, right? So that's my first rule of thumb. Be careful, be safe, stay away from those people. You actually may have to learn from many. I don't know how. I am so blessed because I have a father and a mother who speak Sanskrit, so I can share yoga books and they can read a book and go, that's crap. Oh, this over here, this is good. And I think that's what you have to do. You have to find a trusted person. It may be a person in your community. You might want to start with an Indian person or somebody who has studied with somebody who is known. But I think that the biggest thing is that you watch how they treat the philosophy, how they acknowledge the philosophy, how they treat you, and how they practice. Because your guru is somebody who's going to practice the philosophy, not just teach it. They're still going to be learning, but they're going to teach it in a way that they're honest about it, that they may still be grappling with some of it, but that they're a student of it as well as a teacher. And I think in this day of social media and look how wonderful I am and narcissism, you have to look for authenticity in that way and how they teach. Now, of course, they're all going to be asking for a price. You're going to have to pay for sure, because they have to sustain their living. They can't do this for free. But there are some really good people out there. I can't just push one because I know, and I also know there's a lot of people who are not from Indian culture, but have really dedicated their lives to this stuff, and they're really honest. And what I would say is that when you meet that person or you're looking at their website, they're not going to be completely flashy. They're not going to be like, maybe what you think is the royalty of yoga. Like, they're not going to look like Rodney Yee or Colleen Seidman or whatever, and they're not going to be like held to that esteem. They might just be some person who teaches in their basement, but they're really passionate about it, and they want to teach. Or maybe they are well known. A lot of people have books. Look at what they've look at what they've written on their website. Some of them don't have books because it's really hard to get a book published nowadays, but look at what they've written on their website. Look at how they're promoting themselves in yoga. Is it all about their body image? Is that who you want to follow? So I can't tell people to choose. You're going to choose what you're relatable to. And again, I don't want people to follow blindly. Don't follow blindly. Read what they're saying. How does that relate to you as a person? This teaching is supposed to help you get back in touch with your true self. And the person who guides you there should not be selfish and expecting you to bow down to them. That's taking you away from what yoga is trying to teach. So that's my advice on that.
That's amazing. I love it. That list that you gave us of like, look for these things, especially how that person is showing up in the world and how they're practicing, and are they living their yoga, basically. That's really good. So if we take a look at when we're saying namaste, are we using symbols, and do we know what they are? I know one person on my team is not a yoga teacher, and some questions came up in the group, and she was like, why are people asking about these symbols? Are they Hindi? I was like, no. And she said, I don't want to just jump in there, but it seemed really odd to me that it was a question around what to give someone at the end of a retreat. And she's like, that'd be like me standing at the end of a retreat and like giving everyone a Bible. I think it would be frowned upon. And so I was like, oh my gosh, I never thought of it like that. Like she said, it seems odd to me, Shannon, but I'm not a yoga teacher. So I think we live in a culture as Western yoga teachers that has been it's like the person who's selling those statues didn't tell you, hey, this is what this really means, so you might not want to, face it this way, or put it on your toilet in your bathroom, or put it on the floor. Like, yeah.
Don't put it in the bathroom. Oh my God. Don't put it on the floor. Don't put it in the bathroom. Oh my God, no.
See?
Yeah, exactly.
And so I would be so great. Like, I don't know if there's a list of like, hey, have you checked these things? If you have different symbols in your house, what happens then? Let's say, so I went to a full moon ceremony with some of our Indigenous people here. I was invited as a woman in our community, and I loved some of the things that we were doing there. Now, I've never gone and like, it'd be very different if I brought it home to my house and promoted it as a traditional ceremony by Native Americans, and I'm not Native, and started selling tickets and invited everyone, and then started selling pants. Special
with yoga, right? That's what happens with yoga.
Right. But what if I enjoyed the thing, and this is what's happened with yoga as well.
Yeah.
What if I enjoyed the thing of doing like some part of the ceremony? What are the ways that we can look after yoga and other things from other cultures if we feel like I would like that to be part of my life?
Yeah, I think, the thing about all these rituals is that they're very spiritual, and they really reconnect you to that moment. So when you have that experience, you probably will want to repeat it. And I think it's acknowledging it. Like, okay, I'm not doing the whole thing. This is the part I remember. I'm going to do this at home, but maybe learn more about it and tell the story of it if you're going to do it with other people so that they also hear it. Or, so this is where cultural bypass comes in, right? As a topic. Don't take it out of the culture and then all of a sudden doing it without all the other pieces. This is like whenever you go, if I go to a powwow, I might not know what to do when I'm there. Take the lead from somebody who's there, somebody who's native, and learn from them. And then you can explain it to others. But remember that if all of a sudden I start circle dancing or drumming on beating on a drum, and it's not my culture, that can be really distressing to the other person. You can appreciate it. And I think there's ways you can appreciate it and remind yourself, I'm going to do this little ritual because that's something that really helped me connect to my own inner spirit. And I think, whether it's the Cree people who taught you or the other Anishinaabe people who taught that, acknowledge that, right? Acknowledge it. Acknowledge we're standing on the land of, for me, it's the Haudenosaunee. I can't even pronounce it all. The Mississauga of the New Credit. I mean, that's where I am right now. Acknowledge those things. And remember, we're probably only going to remember one little piece of it when actually all the pieces of it are important in the whole way the ritual was done. And so when we take it out, just remember, we're taking a piece. So I don't know, like this is interesting because I remember one of my teachers who come from India was teaching a chant to our yoga therapy group. And I was like, oh, dudes, you can't do that. You can't use that chant as a white yoga teacher. And he was Indian saying, no, we're using it in a different context. I'm like, I know, but South Asians, Hindu people who use that chant specifically use it at a havan, specifically when we're grieving, when we're mourning, a specific yoga a specific religious ritual. And you can't take that out of the ritual. Because if I was an Indian person walking into a white yoga teacher's class and they said that chant, I would shut them down, because that is something that I chanted when my grandmother died, when my grandfather died, when people I know died, and we did specifically use that for the havan. So I think I can't speak for the other rituals. You might actually have to go back to the person with whom you experienced that and said, what is the proper way for me to incorporate this? Because I found that really powerful. And let them guide you, because I would never be able to guide you on how to do that properly.
That's amazing. I love that we say to someone, gosh, I love this piece of what I just experienced, and how could I respectfully, and knowing also that one person's idea of what is respectful sharing of it is going to change. So maybe ask a few people.
Yeah.
Be okay with like making the mistakes in this, and instead of getting defensive, just going, oh wow, didn't know that. Now I won't do that, because of this. This is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
It's given me so much to think about in terms of what it would feel like. Like, I just want to call back to the beginning where we started, what it would feel like to be shamed for something that you did in your culture, and then have it show up in the same kind of group of people that were shaming you and shaming your community were then doing this thing for profit. Are there ever times where you're just like, maybe this is a really tough question. Maybe this is a really personal question.
Okay, I can go there. I've done my trauma work. Yeah.
Is there ever a time where you think, I want all white people to stop doing yoga? Or...
No, I've not had that, but I've had issues. Like, there are times when I wish people didn't do kirtan, So that kind of irritates me. And probably it's my own trauma of my Sunday. Like, for me, when I do kirtan, it's Sunday morning in my mandir with my community. And we all go around and we all sing. And I know there's people listening outside, and I'm always super conscious of white people walking around listening to us. So I wouldn't say yoga, because I think I'm kind of used to like white people doing yoga, but singing of kirtan is a new thing that has been brought up as it's a yoga thing. And listen, there's nothing more spiritual than music. I think we all agree that, and we all love it. I love listening to gospel music. So I'm trying to work where I feel kirtan fits with this. Because I know that I could listen to an American gospel choir and it gives me so much energy, and I love it. And I know it's sacred Christian music. And I'll walk into, I will go to church just to hear the choir. So I'm working on this myself, but I still, I don't know. It bothers me to hear people singing kirtan when they're singing it wrong, or when the intonation is wrong, or when I know I've been teased for that. And I still struggle with, why is it okay for you to do this in this environment when this is sacred music? Like, do you know? And actually somebody asked me this in my yoga teacher training. She said, we're singing this song and we have to chant Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram. And she's a Buddhist, and she's like, am I chanting something that's, and I was like, yeah, you're basically saying praise Ram. You don't know who Ram is, or his story, or why you should be praising him. You kind of have to wonder about that. But Ram's from the Ramayana, which is one of the major epics of the Indian culture, much as the Mahabharata, which is kind of like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And much like the Greeks had mythology, the Hindus had mythology. So some of that mythology, some people still in India pray to those gods and goddesses, small g, recognizing that they're avatars of this universal force that is present within us. But I know when I'm singing This Little Light of Mine, I know that that's an American gospel spiritual. I understand the words and I know what it is I'm singing. And I don't have a problem with that. But it is problematic for people maybe who are Muslim, who come into a yoga studio and all of a sudden you're singing a Hindu traditional song, because they may have just come for exercise, right? Or may have come for the non-religious spiritual movement, that whatever feeling they get from doing yoga. And then all of a sudden you introduce something that is religious, and that can really make them feel excluded, because there's a lot of trauma between Hindus and Muslims. And so for me, even in my class, or when I'm teaching patients, I never bring in the Gita. I never bring in anything that I think could be remotely religious. I don't chant, although I do offer the Yoga Sutras, and I will chant a sutra. People will ask me about the Gita, and I'll say, okay, this is a story, and this is this part, but I choose to keep my yoga practice and my medical practice secular for many reasons. And I choose to separate that out. For some people, that's not possible, but that's what I do. So that's I don't remember what the question was, but that's my answer.
It's good. It's so good to hear you talk. This is the thing. It really helps me to hear your perspective on this and what it feels like. The original question was, do you wish that all white people would stop practicing yoga? I was
no.
I sure hope she says no.
No, absolutely not. I just want people to acknowledge it. It's such a gift. It's so wonderful. But I do want you to practice it properly. I think, like everything, things can get translated and things can get lost. And I think that in some sense, yoga has been translated and the true meaning and practice has been lost for many. It's not power yoga. You have to recognize that when people went to India in the 60s, they were young and they were taught a yoga that was for young people, meant to give them discipline so they could prepare to meditate. And that practice changes as you age and as you go through the different life stages. And I'm not certain people fully understand how dynamic the practice of yoga is. So to learn about it and think about it in that way without bypassing the culture from which it is from.
Right. And this sounds like, or for me, knowing being a yoga teacher for this long, this is a long journey. This is never over. We are going to re-examine how we do things over and over again. And if we could listen to the founders of yoga, we can learn a lot. So thank you so much for spending the time today and for sharing your stories and for all of your wisdom, as well as tying this into what's happening right now. This was not what we had planned on chatting about.
No. But we're forced to do it, aren't we? Because 2020 has really given us that we need to build clarity around these things, and all of us need to do the work. We need to do the work around our health, our wellness, our communities, and we're really being presented with what's okay and what's not okay. And if it's not okay, we have to learn and make change and be okay with learning that something has to change, and it might be us.
Yeah. This is something that I called out in a newsletter recently. I said, how can I do better around Black Lives Matter? And I got some amazing replies back. because I was open to hearing it. So I'd invite also our podcast listeners. Hey, here are some ideas. Like I could go back and redo the koshas with someone who could speak Sanskrit. That would be really
good. Please. It's so hard. It's so hard to listen. Like the other day I was on Facebook or something and somebody was doing a free Sanskrit chanting. And I was like, oh my God, I had to turn it off. But I loved what you said about be open to ask the questions. Like many of us don't have the answers, and we're moving into this new time. The 2020 is really bringing us clarity that there may not be a roadmap for where we're moving to. And we must be curious, and we should ask the questions, because we're going to need all of society and every person to contribute what they think is, of this, or open up that circle to let other people speak and hear their perspective and what they have to say.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome.
Alrighty, Connected Yoga teachers, I want to hear from you. Thank you again, Shailla, for all of your information. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for answering some tough questions. Connected Yoga teachers, what questions are coming up for you now? What made you really think in this episode? What might change in your own yoga practice? If you have other questions, make sure to post them either in our Facebook group. You can go to theconnectedyogateacher.com to look for the join button right near the top, or you can post your questions on the show notes page. So you go to theconnectedyogateacher.com/184 to get to the show notes for this particular episode. Connected Yoga teachers, I also promised an update about myself. So some of you already know I posted in our Facebook group, and I will link to that thread, that I'm dealing with a diagnosis now. I have a diagnosis with a herniated disc. So my symptoms started near the beginning of August. I remember I was taking a drive with my kids. It was on a Friday. We had an amazing day. And I remember thinking, if only I could stand or walk without feeling this pain. And I didn't slow down. I kept going out to the garden. I garden a lot in the summer, as many of you know, and I think that's what kind of tipped things over the edge. Sitting for work and gardening a lot. So lots of folding forward. Now, I'm not telling you this update to make you feel sorry for me. I have been mainly only able to lie down and kind of half sit up or use crutches to walk. It has been a long journey in the last couple of weeks. It feels like a long couple of weeks, but there are some things that I really have learned along the way, and I plan to continue to add to this. I just wanted to give you a brief update. So in case you're emailing me and wondering why I'm not getting back to you, that's why. In case you're seeing less of me in the Facebook group, that's why. I'm really taking the time to heal as best I can and rest when I need to. And I'm so thankful for our team, and also that we have batched things ahead of time to be able to get the podcast out to you and allow things to still go out and be there for you. So a couple of things that I've learned. Listen to those little pain messages that show up before they become bigger pain messages. That was a huge one for me. I feel like I really learned that the hard way. Also, find the positions and the movements that feel good. Now, we all know this as yoga teachers, but I had many people reaching out to me telling me, like, this movement will help, this movement will help. All with great intentions, all people who have experienced that in their own bodies. And for me, I had to filter it through and see where are the positions that help me to really feel good. And it was a conversation with Shelly Prosco, who has been on the podcast talking about pain. Shelly's a good friend of mine. We were having a chat, and that was the first question she asked me. Tell me about the positions that you can be in that really feel great. So these are two things that I have learned, and I continue to learn and take things in. And I think, wow, an entire podcast could be based on just this topic alone. But I really want to see if I can bring that information to you as I learn. So Huge win today. I went for a swim at my neighbor's pool. I was able to walk around in the pool because there's less gravity pull in the pool. And it felt like a tremendous win when I could walk around without my crutches when I got home. And then I really needed a rest. So it's going to be a slow journey, but I'm up for the learning and I'm up for the healing, and I will try and keep you posted as I go. Huge gratitude to our entire team over here who is doing an amazing job and has been so supportive in this time. Suzanne, Crunch, Nick, and Sinead, I owe you huge hugs and just a pile of gratitude. Thank you so much. Also, thank you, dear listener. You have taken the time to really dig into a conversation today that isn't always the easiest to have. I am excited. I feel like we're just opening the doors to this conversation of how can we really appreciate the culture of yoga and not be part of cultural appropriation instead. Before I sign off today, I want to check in with you, connected yoga teachers. What will you be doing to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?